This is Dennis Ramondi. I'm here with my co-host Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our guest today, Francis Bennet. Francis is a former Trappist monk. Francis, at one point in his life, had a major shift in consciousness and has since that time been deeply trying to understand that experience and share it with others. He runs an organization, Finding Grace at the Center. Francis, thank you so very much for coming on our show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Francis, you seem to be in good company with people like Thomas Merton, who were monks in the Catholic tradition and then expanded their range of expertise and influences. And in your case, it was precipitated, it seems like, by an inner spontaneous experience. Maybe you can give us a little, or give the listeners a little background into your own path and how you came to be doing the work you're doing today.
Sure. Well, like you say, I was a Trappist monk. I was at the monastery of Thomas Merton, actually, at Gethsemane, long after him, however. I'm not quite that old. He died in 1968,
Yeah.
So when I was like 8 years old. So I didn't know Thomas Merton personally. But I got interested in his books from a high school English teacher who told me I was writing a lot of poetry at the time, and he told me that my poetry reminded him of a writer that he was doing a dissertation on, and he said he had been a monk, and so he got me reading first The Seven-Story Mountain, and then I read other books by Merton, and spanning the whole sort of 27 years of his writing, which also got into comparative religion and Buddhism and so on. So that was sort of spurred my interest, and then I ended up entering Gethsemane at the age of 22, and because of Merton kind of being a trailblazer with sort of religious dialogue and things, there was a lot of interreligious dialogue going on at Gethsemane at my time there, with Buddhist monks, and the Dalai Lama came, Thich Nhat Hanh, people like that. And so I got very interested in Buddhism, and then studied Zen with several Zen teachers. Sonsa Nim, who was a Korean Zen master, founder of the Providence Zen Center and the Kwang-Ang School of Zen, Korean School of Zen in the United States, and then Charlotte Joko Beck, who was from a Soto Zen background, and founded San Diego Zen Center. So that was my first sort of foray into Buddhist practice, and then later on, I actually only did I did Buddhist practice for probably about 10 years with these two different teachers. But then for about a good 20 years, I did Vipassana practice through the Insight Meditation Society lineage, and eventually connecting with Bhante Gunaratana, Hanepala Gunaratana, who's the author of Mindfulness in Plain English, a kind of well-known Vipassana-related book. So I got very deeply into Vipassana practice, and then was asked to teach by Bhante, so I actually taught Vipassana for a time. And so over the years, I had many different little sort of opening spiritual awakenings, you could say, and then in 2010 had a kind of major sort of paradigm shift, I would say, that really turned everything on its head, and most of my theology and religious and spiritual ideas flew out the window after that. So that's a little synopsis, like a Reader's Digest condensed version of my background.
So, Francis, when you had that transformative experience, was it something that was experienced by the senses, by the eyes, by the ears, or was it something that was more internal? Was it a deep insight on an intellectual basis? Did it involve emotion? How can you best describe specifically what that experience was and maybe continues to be?
I would say it was all of the above. It was, I was in church in the middle of Mass, actually, and we were celebrating Mass. The community was celebrating Mass, and there were a lot of lay people, and people filled the church, and I was up in the front with the other members of the community, and usually what we would do is we would circle around the altar, and we'd all receive, the brothers and fathers that were part of the Mass that day would all circle around the altar, and they'd put the Eucharist, the communion wafer, in our hands, and then we would take communion, and then we would go distribute communion to the people. And so when they put the host in my hand, I had a very strange feeling of presence, stronger than usual. I've often felt experiences of God's presence over the years since I was really a child, but in that moment it was very, very strong. And there was a kind of physical phenomena of light, of seeing the light kind of emanating from the Eucharist and sort of enveloping me and enveloping the whole church. And my sense was that it was going out into the world. And the revelation that I had with that kind of phenomenal experience was that this light, this presence, actually filled everything that existed, and that was what was kind of revealed to me. The way I put it into words in my book and when I speak about it is that God is in everything and everything is in God, and that was kind of what I saw in that moment, and that's kind of never left. I mean, that realization has remained, and then there's been other dimensions of that have sort of been revealed and have unfolded for me since then.
Can we, Francis, I'm curious about the experience itself of that initial moment in the church. Do you have any sense of how long it lasted? Were you in a position where you had to speak or conduct part of the service?
I was supposed to go on and conduct part of the service, and I was supposed to not speak. I wasn't preaching that day, but I was supposed to give communion out, and I couldn't do it. I actually had to go to the side into the choir stalls and sit down because I was so totally kind of overwhelmed by the experience. How long the experience lasted? Well, I would say it's still going on. So, that's a long time.
I mean, at that moment before you said I got to go sit down, was it instantaneous, or did it have some duration and time that you're aware of?
You mean just the phenomena of seeing the light?
Yeah.
Yeah, that continued on for the rest of the Mass. I was really aware of a light phenomena of light. And, and for, I would say a good, probably 7 to 8 months after that, it really kind of struck me dumb in a way. I was, I really was a lot more kind of withdrawn, and I just felt like I needed to enter into that as fully as I could. So I really just sat in my room a lot and did a lot of sitting and just kind of entered into the depths of that presence, or that sense of God being in everything, and just kind of marinated in it for close to a year before eventually there was a kind of further sort of shift out of that helped me integrate back more into the world. But luckily I was a monk, so it wasn't so difficult to be in that space for that length of time.
That would be my question, Francis. You were a Trappist monk. Your life was being lived, much of it in prayer and silence and in spiritual exploration. Had you been a school teacher, a fireman, a doctor, and would have had an experience like that in church or maybe in nature or anywhere, do you think the experience would have been more confusing for you? Because I assume that because of your background in spirituality, you frame that experience within the context of a spiritual insight or development. But if you were just a guy on the street and that experience came to you, do you think it would have been more confusing?
Who knows? It was confusing enough for me as a monk. So. I don't know. My sense is that life unfolds sort of the way it's meant to, and to a sort of theoretical sort of question like that is hard to answer, because if I had been a fireman, I have a lot of fireman relatives actually, interestingly, but if I had been a fireman or a policeman or a father with 12 kids or something, I'm sure I would have experienced that differently, but I wasn't that, so It's hard to say, what would have been the kind of ramifications of that in a different context. But
well, what was the experience like with your fellow monks? Did you have anybody you could discuss it with? How did they react to your description of it, if you in fact described it at all?
Oh yeah, I did describe it, and my spiritual director said it would be good for me to journal about it, because at first I actually couldn't even speak about it for a while. It was very clear I'd had some kind of experience, and when I was scheduled to preach, I would get up to preach, and I would usually carefully prepare sermons and things and teachings, because I did work with novices, and I taught in the monastery and things, and all my preparation would just fly out the window, and I literally got up one time, I remember soon after that, and I was supposed to do a read, and preach, and I went up to read the gospel, and when I looked at the lectern and looked at the gospel written there, it looked like just bits of scratchings on a paper. I couldn't my mind would not make words into it. It was very strange, and I'd have notes there, and I wouldn't be able to read them. So I just speak sort of extemporaneously, and people would be very moved, and it would really have an effect. And my preaching and my ministry in general kind of took on a different sort of aspect altogether, and something was really flowing through me. So the other brothers in my community could sense that I had, and they felt I'd had some kind of mystical experience or something. But for a long time, I couldn't speak about it until my spiritual director said, "Well, you need to write about this, because maybe your greater understanding of it on a level where you can articulate it could be helpful to others." And so I began writing, and then out of that, after about a year, I wrote in little notebooks and would give it to him when I'd see him once a month. And after about a year of that, he said, "I think you have a book here." And so we got together and sort of edited it and organized it into chapters. And then this book, I Am That I Am, was my first book, and that's how it was written. It wasn't even written as a book. It was just a journal, and then it kind of morphed into a book.
It sounds like you had a good support system of people who were understanding of an experience that might have lay a little bit outside their own framework.
Yeah, I think a lot of monks in contemplative monasteries have very deep mystical experiences and even awakenings. They might speak about it differently. They speak about it as Christians would speak about it, but I think a lot of them have really deep, authentic experience. So it wasn't like I was, that none of them had ever been exposed to any kind of experience like that. So I did get support, but then I also got a little challenge from people when I finally got the journals into book form. There was a theologian that got a hold of it and read it, and I had a meeting with him, and he met with the brothers in the monastic community I was in, and he came, and then we were talking about publishing it, and he said, "Well," he said, I think you've had an authentic mystical experience, but really the way you're articulating it here would be considered pantheistic. So if you want to publish it under, and remain a religious, then you have to adapt it a little bit, and I couldn't do that, and so for a while it wasn't published, but then eventually I left monastic life, and it did get published. So
when you left,
so I did get support, but I also got a little bit of challenge here and there.
Francis, when you left monastic life, did you have the support of the community of monks you were living with? And then when you left, did you seek out other teachers or writings that would help you further understand your own experience?
Yeah, I did have their support. I mean, when I left, I actually was given a fairly large sum of money to help me get started out, and I was able to have enough to buy a car and sort of settle myself. And but yeah, I did seek out some other people, and just to kind of talk to that I thought may have had similar experiences, and that was supportive and affirming. You know, when I was still in the monastery, I was kind of looking for someone else who might have some understanding of what had happened to me. And, you know, like I said, I'd studied Vipassana and Zen, so the idea of awakening, or like even to talk about enlightenment or that kind of thing, was not really a new concept for me. But then when you actually go through something like that, it's very different than what you kind of imagine it will be like, you know, when you kind of fantasize about it. So
interesting. How much did you subsequently investigate the Advaita and non-dual Buddhist traditions, and how much did they inform your subsequent work?
Well, the non-dual Buddhist traditions I had been investigating for over 20 years. So that wasn't like a new thing for me. I'd studied with Zen masters, I'd studied with Vipassana meditation masters, and even ordained, very controversially, ordained for a year in a temporary ordination in the Theravadan tradition when I was still a Christian monk. So that was a lot of Christian monks have done that with Zen, but no one had done that with Vipassana, but I did. And so those, and I was even teaching Vipassana. I'd been asked to teach Vipassana in the Theravadan tradition. And so I was pretty familiar with a lot of the Buddhist ideas. The Advaita thing, 3 years before that, I had run across this pamphlet in French. I was in a French community at the time in Montreal, and I ran across this little pamphlet, Nanyar, Who Am I, by Ramana Maharshi. And I had read that, and I was really struck by how similar it was to contemplative prayer, that self-investigation, or Atma-vichara, that Ramana talked about, was for me essentially resting and like looking at or gazing at the sense of awareness or presence that's within us. And a contemplative prayer is a kind of contemplative gazing at the presence of God that's within us. And so I really saw them as essentially the same practice. And for 3 years before this big shift happened in 2010, I'd say between 2007 and 2010, I was doing very, very intensive self-investigation practice, and kind of a blend of the contemplative prayer practice and self-investigation. So it was sort of self-investigation with a devotional kind of quality to it, you could say. And I think that was part of the impetus that sort of pushed me over that edge. So I had already done a good bit of investigation into Eastern and been involved in Buddhist-Christian dialogue with a lot of Tibetan and Zen monks and over many, many years. So those teachings weren't really new to me. But I resonated a lot more, I'd say, with the Buddhist actual teachings on an actual kind of teaching level. I'd say I resonated more with the Buddhist teachings, and then also I would say in my teaching now, I really do draw on Christian mysticism and Buddhist teaching quite a bit, and I always attribute it to Buddhist teaching if I borrow some teaching of the Buddha. But in my retreats and my work with individuals, I still use a lot of things from both Christian mystical traditions and Buddhist traditions.
Francis, do you still consider yourself a Christian? And what differentiates a Christian in your mind from a Buddhist or a Hindu or any other religion for that matter? And as a Christian, do you feel, if you still feel as one, do you feel it's still your role to proselytize and try to get people to that faith?
First of all, it's not my role to proselytize in any way, shape, or form. So I just have to make that really clear right from the beginning. I guess I would still consider myself a Christian in a certain way, but I'm not really a traditional Christian anymore, and most of my theology has long flown out the window, even though I have degrees in theology. But I guess I'm kind of a hybrid Christian Buddhist or something, or a Buddhist Christian. I'm not sure. So, yeah, I'm kind of an odd bird, as my dad used to say.
How does the experience, your life as a whole post 2010 changed your understanding of who Jesus was or your relationship to him, if it has changed at all?
Oh, yeah, it's changed tremendously. I think I held to traditional theology a lot of my life, and so I believe that Jesus was the second person of the Holy Trinity, and that he died for our sins and rose again, and that we believed in him, and he was our path to eternal life and basic Christian beliefs. And then gradually over time, and then really clinching it after 2010, I would no longer see Jesus as an exclusive divine person, but I think he had a revelation of his own divinity. But my sense is that my intuitive sense in reading between the lines of the extant sort of literature documents we have of Jesus' teaching, I would say what he was pointing to is what all awakened beings point to, which is that we're all divine, that we're all really God in the flesh, which is what is attributed to him, but that he wasn't attributing that exclusively to himself, but to all, to everyone.
Right.
And that's the way I would understand it.
Francis, I watched your interview on with Rick Archer, who, by the way, is a friend of Phil and mine, on Buddha at the gas pump. And one of the things you discussed was, I think Rick might have put you in touch with a gentleman that had an experience of awakening, much like yours, and how you found it very useful to speak to somebody who had a similar experience.
Yeah. Yeah, there were several people that I was got into contact with after that. And then eventually I got to meet and became friends with Adyashanti. And so there's been any number of people. And then since then, just since I've been teaching in this sort of spiritual scene, I guess, for lack of a better term, I've met a lot of different teachers, some of whom I feel like I have a lot in common with, and some maybe not as much. So.
Let's pursue that a little bit. There are a lot of people on the contemporary spiritual circuit teaching in the name of non-dualism and Advaita, and they are not by any means uniform. What is it you find different in those who, you said some are different from how you approach things or how you see things, which is not what people might expect from people who all hold to some non-dualism, because they were to think it would be non-dual. And therefore uniform in how it's perceived and expressed. Where do you take exception to?
I guess that I would probably see my own understanding and my own path as it's unfolded to be more in line with a lot of the more classical sort of Advaita stuff I've read and been exposed to, and certainly classical Buddhist non-dual stuff, where I really feel that there's a full circle of awakening. I have a teaching that I actually talk a lot about lately, and I call it full circle awakening. So my sense is that there is a transcendent movement where we awaken up and out of a merely human identification. So we come to understand in that awakening that we're not primarily or merely or exclusively a body, a mind, a human personality, and so on, but that there's a dimension of pure spirit or consciousness that is the kind of essence of who we are, and we do awaken to that. But I would say that there's a kind of continuing journey of awakening that actually eventually, I talk about even an awakening from awakening, that we awaken from this sense of transcendence, kind of exclusive transcendence, and we actually wake down and into a kind of embodiment of what it means to be an awakened person living in a human life. And so we learn to embody it in the world, and we integrate ordinary everyday life into awakened consciousness. So it's not just a matter of like waking up and out of the merely human and just then hanging out in transcendence and just forgetting the world and forgetting your body and not identifying with any of it. But it's like a waking up and out of that and then waking back down and into it, but with a completely different perspective. So we navigate it then from an absolute perspective, but we realize it's only relatively real. It's not absolutely or ultimately real, but it all has the life of the body, the life of the world, the phenomenal reality all around us, nature and all that. That it all is, in a certain sense, a manifestation of the divine, of consciousness. And so it's all divine then. It's kind of radically contingent upon the reality of consciousness or God or whatever you want to call that, but it's not excluded from that. So I think a lot of the contemporary non-dual teaching really is a little lopsided in emphasizing transcendence, and not so much has it really entered into a kind of more integrated sort of expression of that, then I would say. So I'd say that's probably my major place of departure from maybe a lot of contemporary, like non-dual sort of teachers.
Francis, I wanted to ask about the work I read you've done in hospice with the sick and dying. Since your transformative experience, since your experience of awakening, how has that changed your work around people that are making that transition from life to death? And what do you think happens after a person's body is finished and it is no more?
Yeah, I would say it did change my experience. I was still doing that work after that time for a period of time. And I would say the primary thing that I did after that was just the way I ministered to people who were in the dying sort of experience or process would be to just create a space for them, like to just be present to them, and to let presence itself sort of touch their lives and bring healing, to their hearts and minds. And so it really did become a very powerful work for me to do in light of my sort of awakening. It felt like it was much more powerful after that. And I still actually am called into situations where people are dying. I think a lot of my students, they know that I did that kind of work. And so if they have a dying loved one or something, sometimes I've had the opportunity to visit them and talk with them. And so, and then what happens after we die? Was that second part of your question?
Yes.
Yeah, that's who knows, I don't.
It's a good answer.
I have my own,
an honest answer.
I have my own ideas and beliefs about that, but if I talked about that, then you'd have some sense of my ideas and beliefs. But I guess, that might be useful for you, or it might be confusing. So it's sort of like, my sense is that, well, after we die, then we'll know, won't we?
Exactly.
Until that time, it's all theory and guesswork and beliefs and,
well
Francis,
put.
The life of a Christian monk or a devout Christian who's not a monk is often a very devotional one, centered on love of Jesus or Mary or whatever. Do you, as a sort of person who's embodying a non-dual experience of the world and teaching it, do you retain a devotional life, and how does that fit into the notion of non-dualism, whereas a lot of non-dual people reject the notion that there's anything to even be devoted to?
Yeah, I would say that's primarily a neo-Western non-dual spin on that teaching. If you go to India and you talk to some people who were like Ramana Maharshi, or even the founder of Advaita Vedanta, Shankara, they were highly devotional people.
That's right.
Shankara wrote hymns to the Divine Mother. Ramana had great devotion to the mountain Arunachala and circled it and sang hymns of devotion. And when his devotees sang hymns to Shiva and so on, he he would dissolve into tears. So I think the idea that non-duality is somehow incompatible with devotion is just a kind of Western dumbing down of the tradition, because I really don't think you find that in the classical Advaita tradition.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
Francis, could you tell us and our listeners about some of the work you're doing now if they want to follow up and find out more about your activities?
Well, I have this website, Finding Grace at the Center, which has kind of become the organization. There's been a little sort of formation of an organization kind of around me to help me with my work, organizing retreats and things, which I'm not especially good at doing. Some people showed up. Some people showed up on the scene and decided to help me. Thank goodness. So if they go to my website, my events and things, so I do retreats and go around the country and do retreats, and I go to Europe actually a lot too, and do retreats in England and Ireland.
We should say that the website is findinggraceatthecenter.com.
Yep, that's it.
And that'll be.
Yep.
Do you teach any spiritual techniques to people taking these, or any techniques of insight that you would recommend to people?
Well, yeah, I mean, I do. I guess I divide my sort of teaching approach on sadhana or spiritual practice into three basic practices that have been part of my own spiritual journey, and I think you can find these three practices in all the classical spiritual paths in one form or another. And so I talk a lot about meditation, surrender, and service, selfless service in the world. And I think it's a lot like, I often compare it to, if you want to get fit. I was pretty involved in athletics in high school and stuff, and so had to get conditioned to do wrestling and track and things like that. So if you're on a kind of fitness regime, you actually do work with your diet, you do anaerobic exercise and aerobic exercise, like, for cardiovascular health and so on. And they each answer different kind of needs of your body to help you get a kind of integrated and holistic approach to optimal kind of physical condition. And I think the same with spirituality. If you have these three practices, they, in different ways, they address spiritual needs. So meditation helps us kind of get more in touch with this consciousness that does dwell already within us beneath the surface of our lives. And surrender, I see as a kind of practice that puts us, gives us access to that same consciousness in the midst of challenging situations in life. So I often talk about surrender as being meditation in action. And then service really flows out of wisdom. If we have a non-dual insight that, okay, I'm one with everything, there's no separation, there's no separate entity here, but I'm really actually one with all that exists, then we act accordingly. When somebody's in pain, when the world is in need of cleaning up and the environment needs help, or when animals are being abused, or when there's war or illness, it touches our heart because we're not separate from that, So I think non-dual wisdom just naturally gives rise to service. So I talk about those three practices as the path that's probably a kind of balanced path that could work for a lot of people. So that's the way I sort of present that.
Francis, we're running out of time now. I want to again repeat that your website is findinggraceatthecenter.com. You also have a very active Facebook presence. I always enjoy seeing what you post there. And I want to refer listeners to your interviews with our friend Rick Archer on Buddha at the Gas Pump, which is BATGAP, BATGAP.com, where they'll find longer and more extended, detailed interviews with you, because Rick goes much longer than we do. And they can find that at the link to past interviews. Is there anything you'd like to leave our listeners with before we have to go?
Well, nothing's popping into my head, but I guess I would just say, follow your heart in life, and your heart will lead you to your kind of ultimate meaning. And I've found that works. That's worked for me, I think. So that would be my kind of basic advice.
Great. Thank you so very much for taking the time to come on. We've been chatting with Francis Bennet, former Trappist monk, and now a teacher, leading people in a direction of greater self-knowledge and spirituality. It's been a pleasure having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Francis.